Good morning, everyone. This is Jeremy Martin here at the Institute of the Americas in La Jolla. Happy Thursday morning, happy Thursday afternoon, depending upon where you may be today. In terms of time zone, we are very happy to continue with our energy webinar series and have somebody who's never joined us before and participating to share some views and insights. And that's Emily Medina, who's an Energy Policy Research Foundation non-resident fellow. Hello, Emily.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining.
Are you dialing in from Yucatan or Washington? Where are you?
I'm currently in Mexico City.
In Mexico City?
Yes.
Excellent, excellent. Well, there's always a lot going on in Mexico, and even more so, in the last several months. And that's exactly what we've invited Emily to share with us today. And I don't want to belabor too much her presentation or take away what she's going to talk about. But I think everyone who's joining us today is very curious to continue to get more information about the natural gas outlook for Mexico. And I think just in the way of background, it is a topic of great importance. It's been something, particularly in the bilateral relationship, that has absolutely boomed in the last several years with an enormous amount of infrastructure and investment and pipelines that have been built to allow Mexico to see some of the opportunity presented by the U.S.'s shale gas revolution and frankly take advantage of not just supply but price and really be able to develop a robust energy sector in Mexico more based on gas and displacing some old school fossil fuels in the power matrix. And so there's a whole host of things to talk about. More recently, in the geopolitical or political arena, we've seen some developments with the new government and some of the posture taken towards projects and frameworks developed in the last several years. And I think Emily's going to share with us some insights on that. And so we really want to be able to have Emily share these insights. And then, of course, as you know, and anyone who's joined us for the webinar series, we always do sort of half and half, where we'll spend about half of the time on the webinar this morning with Emily making her formal presentation. And then we'll spend the last half, 20 minutes or so, maybe a little bit more, with question and answer. And so we do that via the chat function there on your screen. So I just wrote the word question. So at any time during Emily's formal presentation, feel free to jump on there and make a comment, pose a question, and we'll come back at the end once Emily's finished with her formal remarks and have a Q&A and discussion with Emily. I just want to emphasize that how pleased I am to be able to have Emily join us. She's somebody that I only met a few months ago. In fact, it was at a Mexico Energy event at the Wilson Center in Washington, D.C. And so it's always a pleasure to have I think, Emily, you were on a panel there called Fresh New Voices or something like that, or New Voices of the Energy Sector in Mexico.
Exactly, yeah.
And for old farts like me, it's good to get some fresh voices, get away from me and get some fresh voices. So I don't want to take any more time, and I want to be able to have Emily share with us her insights. And again, thank you for joining us. Over to you, Emily Medina from the Energy Policy Research Foundation with her remarks on natural gas in Mexico.
Great. Thank you, Jeremy, and thank you to the Institute of the Americas for the invitation to be here today. I am going to pull out my presentation right now.
Loading that right now. It should be there. Sorry, we're having trouble loading Emily's presentation. Not there. Maybe load it. Sorry, folks, stand by. For some reason, the presentation is not loading. Well, Emily, while Jackie's trying to get that loaded up, I don't want to have too much time wasted here. Why don't is there any way you can start giving some context? Maybe you and I can ask you a question.
Sure. Yeah. Why don't I walk us over the presentation? So I'm going to give a brief overview of the topics that I plan to touch on today. So first, I want to begin by giving an overview on Mexico's current natural gas situation, looking at the production and consumption of natural gas in the country. I also want to give an overview on the imports versus domestic production trends that we are seeing in Mexico, and touch on AMLO's national strategy and his aim at taking on and bringing production up to his proposed goals. So it's important to understand some of the developments that we're all hearing about in the news in regards to the status of the energy reform. So one of the main issues that we're hearing is the 3-year temporary suspension on the bidding rounds, and recently just announced in August the suspension of farm outs, which are joint ventures between Pemex and private sector companies. So currently, as we know, there's been 111 contracts assigned to private companies. And so far, we're starting to see some production gains off of that. And I will illustrate what that production looks like in a later graph. I will end my presentation with some of the risks and opportunities that I have identified in Mexico's energy sector in the current moment with Andrés Manuel López Obrador as president for the next 6 years. So in my first graph, I will describe it to everyone. But if we can picture it in our heads, right now, our consumption of natural gas, so Mexico's consumption of natural gas is around 8 billion cubic feet per day. Compared to our production at 2.5 billion cubic per day, there's a big gap that is currently being filled by U.S. natural gas imports. So that gap represents 5.4 billion cubic feet. And with that comes some implications for Mexico's energy security. And in line with AMLO's view of strengthening the country's state oil companies, specifically Pemex, and with his view of increasing Mexico's energy sovereignty, there's some conflict that comes with the huge amount of imports that we're receiving today and his view of what should be done.
Hey, Emily.
Yes.
Your slides are on.
Okay.
Hopefully everyone can see that.
So we
have it. Thank you so much. Perfect. Thank you.
Yeah. So here, this was just a graph that I was describing right now, where we can see the 8 billion cubic feet of natural gas being consumed in Mexico, and at the same time, the production of natural gas in Mexico at around 2.5 billion cubic feet per day, and the imports that are satisfying that need for additional natural gas that's being met with with mostly U.S. natural gas imports, as 90% of natural gas imports come directly from the U.S. So all of this gas is, well, not all of it, but the majority of it, 60% of it, is going directly to Mexico's power plants, which are controlled and owned by CFE. On the next slide, we should be able to see a graph. For some reason, it's not showing. But here, I basically go further in detail on the amounts that Mexico is importing. So we have a very different picture today than we had in 2007. So about a decade ago, we were importing 1.1 billion cubic feet per day. And today, Mexico is importing 5.4 billion cubic feet per day from the U.S. So just on the last decade, our imports have risen significantly, and with that, some of our energy security risks, as we rely heavily on one source, on one country for our imports. So this definitely raises our vulnerability to some indirect shocks that could happen. Just for example, a hurricane or a natural disaster. This could really affect our supply of natural gas, and could in turn affect our electricity system. So that's one of the current issues that Mexico has right now in terms of the huge amount of imports that it receives from the U.S. At the same time, there are several benefits that come from increased U.S. natural gas imports. And that's a direct benefit is the affordable natural gas prices that we are seeing in the U.S. natural and the U.S. production centers, to name a few. I mean, Waha, Permian are the vivid examples of how the U.S. has increased its production in natural gas over the last decade and realized a boom in shale gas production. So, in the graph, we can see sometimes even in Waha, we get negative pricing. So that has a direct benefit on Mexico's energy prices, as we're able to import affordable gas from the U.S. to electrify our system. Here on the next slide, I put a slide to illustrate the regional price index for natural gas in Mexico. This regional pricing system just took place in 2018, so it's a very recent development that is still maturing, and right now there's a need to push this natural gas market-friendly system to reflect the current pricing of energy, instead of having artificial pricing as we've had in the past before the energy reform. So in this map, we can see the different zones and different prices realized in different parts of the country. And I mean, obviously in the north, they're getting the most affordable natural gas prices today, compared to some other places like the south that right now is lacking on natural gas to feed its power plants. So this, to give an example of the Yucatan, the lack of natural gas flowing into south of Mexico is really increasing electricity prices for consumers. And now that more infrastructure is getting built, to name a recent example, the Sur de Texas two-span pipeline, we are going to see more natural gas flows going into the south of Mexico, which will in turn positively affect pricing. Because right now, currently, most of the power plants in the south are being fueled and fed by diesel and fuel oil, which not only is more expensive than natural gas, but it's also more high. It's more intensive on its carbon dioxide emissions, which are contributing to climate change. So it's definitely an issue that needs to be addressed. And there needs to be more fuel switch, not only in the south of Mexico, but throughout Mexico. And that's the current trend, which is a very positive sign. So here in this graph, I want to show you a picture of the Mexico's prospective resources. So Mexico has huge quantities of natural gas and oil, and that's, I mean, we're geographically, we have those characteristics, which is very good for a country with our demographics and close proximity to the US, because we can better integrate our energy markets. And I mean, in the past, historically, Mexico used to, I mean, it still does, but it used to have, when Mexico's energy production was in healthy levels, we not only provided energy security for Mexico, but also for the U.S. And right now, we're kind of seeing the same, conversely, the same picture where the U.S. is right now helping Mexico in energy security by providing affordable gas. So it's interesting. And then here, and we can see the recursos prospectivos, which are the prospective resources. And these are the main basins in Mexico with potential for natural gas. So in Veracruz, is where we can find the Ixachi field, which I will talk more about later. So here in this table, we can see the distribution of prospective resources. So Pemex has 23% of the national prospective resources, which is the largest amount, compared to an 11% of prospective national resources held by the currently awarded contracts. And then on the bottom, we can see that state-owned areas that have yet to be assigned represent 67% of prospective resources. So as we can see, there's clearly further need for Mexico to assign those areas that haven't been assigned and that are owned by the Mexicans and by the state. So right now, with the pause of the bidding rounds, this 67% of prospective areas are standing and are not being developed, are just waiting to have continuation. But right now, they're basically on hold. And this represents a huge lost opportunity for Mexico to develop its own oil and gas resources. As we know, energy projects are mostly long-term and take about I mean, approximately 5 to 10 years to see, a project from beginning to end. So if right now, I think it's imperative for the government to take action on those 67% prospective resources, because otherwise we run the risk of them becoming stranded assets. In this graph, I like I mentioned earlier, we can see the production of natural gas from the 111 contracts in comparison to the production of gas from Pemex. So this is the projection right now. And because we have such a reduced number of contracts, we are seeing that the production is in 2019 is 3.6 billion cubic feet per day in comparison to 2032, where we have 5.9 billion cubic feet per day. So these projections are not enough to actually comply with the goals set forth by AMLO on his recent plan, which are to include, to increase oil production to 2.6 million barrels of oil per day in the next 6 years. So if we want to really increase production up to those levels, there's a need for further increase on investments from the private sector. On my next slide, I talk about the status of the energy reform and what's being done and what's being changed since AMLO took office. And there's several things. So first, Pemex is accelerating the development of 22 onshore and shallow water fields entirely via contratos de servicios integrales de exploración y extracción. So before, we had the farm-out process and the farm-out system, which allowed Pemex to partner with private sector companies to enhance production by having the private sector transfer some of its technology, knowledge, and innovative practices over to Pemex, which has been proven to not be I would say efficient enough in its processes to actually materialize production. So the declines that we're now seeing in Mexico in production are mainly due to the fact that there's been a historic monopoly over Mexico's energy sector. So fast forward to, the Pemex own monopoly lasted about 8 decades. And in 2014, Enrique Peña Nieto decided to pass the energy reforms with the intention of opening up the energy sector for foreign investment and to increase the role of private sector companies in the development of oil and gas resources. And right now, and through farm outs, which still gave Pemex an important role in this whole energy system. So right now, what's changed is that AMLO and his administration prefer to have the private sector companies participate through service contract. And this is very different because instead of them developing the resources, they just provide some services, but they do not participate in the whole value chain and the whole process from exploration and production so right now this is a big concern, because if we're going to realize that production, we need their participation from beginning to end, and in a thorough way that consists on exploration and production. And so we can see that this administration has already injected a lot of capital into Pemex to strengthen its capabilities and to provide the resources so it can thrive. However, I argue that it's not enough to just inject more money into Pemex and to hope that production will magically increase. So there needs to be a more comprehensive approach, and I think this administration should reconsider starting the farm out processes again. So on one of the priority projects for Pemex as part of this new plan that's been carried out by Pemex with this administration is to increase production in Ixachi. So Ixachi is an onshore natural gas field in Veracruz. So there's been some the reason why this is one of the main projects in Mexico right now is that it has a necessary infrastructure, and it's easier to increase production that way compared to other fields like in the Burgos Basin, which has huge and abundant resources, but it's harder to get production to the demand centers. So the prospects for developing the Ixachi fields are positive, and it will depend on Pemex's ability to carry out the production all by itself as it's currently planned. And like I mentioned, Ixachi is one of the 20 fields for that Pemex is planning to develop, and the development of this field represents a 6.4 billion investment, and with the prospects of it peaking in 2022 at 638 million cubic feet per day. So this is one of the projects that the administration has on natural gas, and it's a positive sign that we're going to see more production growth in natural gas, and particularly in this field. However, it's not enough to satisfy the growing natural. So the budget, so Pemex budget also allocates 238 million pesos for the 7 shale oil and gas pilot projects in the Sabinas, Burro Picachos, Burgos, Tampico, Misanda, and Chihuahua basins, up from 171 million approved for the same projects in 2019. So these are all areas that have high prospectivity, and right now it's a matter of political will to carry out those projects. So in other gas-focused line items in the budget include the integrated Veracruz and Burgos projects, which received allocations of 384 million and 157 million respectively. So it's important to given that the current administration banned fracking, it will be important to see what happens in the development of these fields to increase natural gas production. And finally, I want to conclude with some overview of the risks and opportunities that exist right now in Mexico's energy sector. So one of the main risks is that the suspension of the joint ventures between Pemex and the private sector could prevent further assignment of the 64% prospective resources owned by the state. So by suspending the joint ventures, we can see larger presence by Pemex and a reduced role played by the private sector. So another big risk right now is putting the oil block auctions on hold. As I mentioned before, failure to assign those blocks in a timely manner could increase the risk of the prospective resources in the country and becoming stranded in the long term. But if we are going to increase production, we need to start thinking about assigning those blocks as soon as possible, as was intended with the passing of the energy reform. So another risk that we're seeing is the failure to meet AMLO's oil and gas production targets. Right now, I mean, there's been rating companies such as Fitch and Moody's have already stated that the goals planned by this administration are unfeasible based on the current situation. So if we're serious about reaching those goals, or at least coming a little bit more close to them, there's going to need to be a lot more participation coming from the private sector, because we need the capital that comes with those investments and the technology as well. So if AMLO carries through and follows through on his current view of stopping joint ventures and not assigning more oil blocks, we risk a potential downgrade for Pemex that could affect sovereign ratings and the Mexican economy. So it's an important issue to consider, and if we look at the opportunities, there's huge opportunities to be had still on Mexico's energy sector. The energy reform just started in 2014, and it's been a fairly recent development, and there definitely needs to be continuation to some of the policies that were intended to be materialized during the past administration and future ones. So just from the contracts, the government takes 72 to 74% of the cost. So the private companies are by law have to give 72 to 70% back to the government. So just by this, you can have a direct economic benefit to Mexico. And I think right now it shouldn't be overlooked. And given the global economic situation, I think it's a very important issue to consider. And so another opportunity that the government has is to resume joint ventures between Pemex and the private sector. And like I said, as soon as possible. So it can be 2019, be it, but if not, I mean, 2020 is right around the corner. So I think it's important to take a serious look at them and take a look based on the evidence that we are seeing. And we are already in a short period seeing some production gains from the 111 contracts. So another opportunity for Mexico is to assign new prospective resources to private companies. There's 64% of Mexico's prospective resources have yet to find a home, and we need the energy, so it makes sense to assign those resources as soon as possible to begin exploration and production activities in the country. So with that, I will conclude my presentation, and I look forward to any questions that you may have.
Excellent. Thank you. That's fantastic, Emily, for a detailed presentation. And I posted a comment. Somebody asked a question about the recording and all the slides. And apologies, Emily, for the little hiccup there at the beginning, but we will distribute the slides at Emily, the PowerPoint presentation, as well as the recording. So everyone will get copies of both of those later today. So before we have a whole host of questions, thank you everyone for being so on top of it with the questions. But I want to go to something as use the privilege of the host and moderator. I'll put two things to you just to quickly get our conversation going here. I heard you say that this administration and fracking, so I want you to clarify that in sort of precise terms what really has developed around that. But also, you didn't, and I may have not heard it properly, but I don't believe you really commented too much on the development of natural gas pipeline contracts and renegotiation between CFE and the contract companies. If you just take a second to help unravel that, I think that would be useful for us to understand, and then we can get to all the other questions we have. So if you could, again, sort of precisar what exactly you mean in terms of ban on fracking, because this is a big question, right?
It's breaking a little. Could you please repeat that?
Yeah, so the first thing is I'd like you to, if you could just add a precision to a comment you made in passing about that the administration has banned fracking, but I'd like to get some precision as to what exactly has happened in that regard.
Okay. So since before taking office, AMLO stated that he wanted to ban fracking because he saw it as a negative activity for the environment, and I mean, so that's his stance on fracking. It's basically saying that that fracking is bad for the environment and the communities. And this is a completely respectable view. However, failure to develop those resources can also affect communities and have an effect on their economies. So it's very interesting. I mean, the whole debate on fracking, on the environmental consequences and what have you. It's a very interesting debate, and it's been changing over the years. I mean, in the U.S. is a perfect example of how it's evolved. And it's evolved in a way that before, when the fracking began in the U.S., there was a lot of regulations that weren't being respected and by companies, and because of a strengthening on enforcement, we are seeing that companies want to comply with those regulations before than they used to, because they see the economic benefit of complying with the regulations that are in place. Just right now, we're seeing, with the methane leaks, how companies are starting to actively put the mechanisms in place to reduce those methane leaks without the government's involvement. So it's a more direct approach that the companies are taking, which, I mean, it speaks to the involvement of the industry over the years. And I think the same goes to Mexico. I mean, I think that it's easy to just say, no, we don't want to do this, and complain about, not having or having increased imports of natural gas. And so I think we need to be serious about finding solutions for natural gas, for where our natural gas will come from. And fracking is a solution, and that the country can make use of. However, it's finding the right mechanisms to develop those resources in a sound way. And right now, I mean, the technology has improved dramatically over the years, where there's more ways to recycle water from the process of fracking, and have stronger regulations around the issues that matter, which involve communities and what have you. So there's definitely, I believe there can be policies in place to prevent social and environmental implications from fracking. It's a matter of, it's a choice that the country makes, and right now I feel AMLO should consider looking more in detail on what type of technologies and best practices exist for hydraulic fracturing today.
Right. No, the fracking is an immensely difficult issue to deal with, and so no, I appreciate your comments on that. Let's jump into some fairly detailed questions here. I'll just go in order that we received them. So thanks everyone for all your wonderful questions here. Emily, so a question about the ability of CFE to keep open older power plants that were scheduled for shutdown. And the specific question is whether that is feasible and if it will lead to higher customer and spot prices.
Okay. Yeah. That's a very good question. Yeah, that's a very good question. So with the energy reform came different plans and different mechanisms to approach infrastructure build out in the country and innovation. So the PRODECEN is an annual report that comes out and looks at the power sector. And in the PRODECEN, the previous administration laid out a plan to gradually retire power plants that were let's say old and inefficient, and that ran on highly intensive fuels. So the PRODECEN laid out a gradual plan to remove those power plants and to switch them with more efficient power plants that ran on natural gas instead of running on coal or fuel oil or diesel. So, and the reason why they did a gradual planning approach to retire the inefficient power plants was to make it to do this to carry this process in the most economically feasible way possible. Because I mean, of course, it takes a lot of resources and investment and capital to build out a new power plant from scratch. I mean, it's not a process that can be done from one day to another. So that's why the plan had a gradual approach. And I think right now the administration is, so instead of having this gradual approach that was in place, it's kind of interrupting this system and this gradual approach by delaying retires of the power plants that run on intensive fuels. So this not only affects economic, this not only affects electricity prices to the end consumer, but it also increases CO2 emissions, which are in the, which goes in the opposite direction of what we should be doing to reach the climate change objectives that Mexico agreed to, which are to increase our renewable energy sources to 30% by 2024.
Right, of course, there's a price, and then as you mentioned, it's not exactly in line with some of the Paris Accord commitments that the country made. I'm going to combine a couple of questions about infrastructure because I think this is they're related. But in terms of the question of importations of natural gas and the need to solve the midstream infrastructure question, and then the first comment somebody makes is that they're concerned over the current composition of the CRE, the Regulatory Commission, Energy Regulatory Commission, and the new group of commissioners who are now in place, the ability for them to grant permits in a timely fashion. And then the related, very specific question about, your thoughts about pipeline infrastructure and how it's going to continue to be an important piece of bridging the supply-demand gap. Is there pipeline infrastructure to move production from the Ixachi field to the southeast? So talk a little bit in general about sort of the constraints around infrastructure, pipeline infrastructure, and then specifically the Ixachi field.
And specifically, sorry, what?
The Ixachi field and this.
Okay. Yeah. So before we used to have severe. Well, we still do now, but thankfully we've had more projects come online, and we see less of a problem with bottlenecks. However, that's been a very big issue in Mexico. So getting the product to market and to demand centers. So Mexico's developed a national pipeline system called Sistrangas, which is the Sistema Integrado de Gas Natural. And this system was developed to distribute natural gas through different parts of the country, from the north to the south, and vice versa, on a purely market-driven way. However, and in addition to the national pipeline system, we also have pipelines operating exclusively by the private sector. So, for example, the Sur de Texas and Tuxpan pipeline which runs from the U.S. to Veracruz, is a highly important project because it helps feed the national distribution network. And it's a very good project because it also helps Mexico get access to affordable and high quality product. And if we compare the product and the gas that comes from the U.S. to the gas that Mexico and Pemex is developing today, we see a contrast in quality and in quantity. Right now, Pemex natural gas production has been declining significantly, and you know, as I mentioned before, you know, we've been benefiting from imports. However, although we get a lot of imports, we're still having trouble distributing the product to market. So there's definitely further need for infrastructure development in the country. And right now, the issue is that the CRE, the Comisión Reguladora de Energía, who is in charge of providing the permits that are necessary to develop this much needed infrastructure, is not following through on the expansion plans that were in place before AMLO took office. So it's important that the CRE expedites the permitting process for infrastructure projects in order to satisfy demands in different parts of the country and to reduce the risk of energy shortages in the country, which are already I would say a recurring theme in some states of the country, including Yucatan. So it will be interesting to see, I mean, what Senagas does in developing a solid natural gas market to incentivize energy infrastructure growth in the country and to assign the capacity of pipelines in a competitive way.
Let me jump in there. We're almost out of time, but I want to jump. I want to jump in because I think what you're talking about could also be related to one of the final questions. Two things about the price question. I think you talked a lot about, and also storage. I mean, where does storage fit in on the national system, right?
Yeah. So pricing is very. It's what incentivizes many of these infrastructure projects. So if we have government subsidies on natural gas prices, then we run the risk of the private sector not wanting to participate in some of these projects as they become unattractive because they favor, for example, Pemex production over some private participants' production or capacity. So in a recent panel that I participated in, I heard the director for Senagas mention that they wanted to establish a subsidized capacity system for the south of Mexico and for some other regions to balance the pricing of throughout Mexico. So this completely is very opposite to the previous administration's plans that wanted to develop those regional pricing indexes. So and it's a big risk for private sector's participation, and I think we need to define on how they are going to subsidize those prices going forward if they are serious about doing this. And at the same time, we need further investment, further development of storage. So right now, Mexico just has 2 days worth of natural gas storage. This is insanely low for the consumption that we have in the country, and especially if we look at where that consumption is going, which is directly going to the power sector. And if we risk, and it's a very big vulnerability that the country has, only having 2 days of storage.
And so, no, exactly. And that was the question, is when you exactly related to this concept and you talk about energy sovereignty and energy security, there's a whole host of issues. Unfortunately, we're running out of time, so we can't get into them too much. I did quickly want to have you comment on something else here regarding price and economics, and that has to do with why Mexico has increased so much of its imports from the United States, because of the cost upside of natural gas, like you mentioned, sometimes even negative pricing coming out of parts of Texas and in the U.S. market. So the question is, do you believe Mexican gas can compete with the cost of U.S. natural gas suppliers in the future?
Well, I believe that's highly unlikely that they will be able to compete with U.S. prices, just because it's a global. What the U.S. has realized in terms of its shale gas production has been a global phenomenon. I mean, it's very hard for any country to replicate that. And it has to do with the right policies and the right time. So, I mean, the U.S. decided to have hydraulic fracturing a decade ago and to be committed to the development of its natural gas resources. And I don't see that same commitment coming from Mexico right now, especially with the current situation where there's a ban on fracking and where there's, the current proposal to strengthen it's not the right approach if we are serious about developing our natural gas in the same way that the U.S. had in the past.
Thank you so much, Emily. Let me do in our classic La Jolla fashion, end with a simple yes or no question. And thank you again for joining us. It's been great, and we will share all of your remarks in this recording and the PowerPoint with everyone. Thanks everyone for joining us today. So here we go, the yes or no question to wrap up. I think I heard you pretty clearly argue. In fact, we still see it on the screen here about joint ventures between Pemex and the private sector. And so let me ask you, yes or no, are you optimistic that the Pemex JVs will take place in 2020?
Yes, I am always an optimist.
Glass is half full, huh?
Yes. I think there are opportunities.
All right, yes, I think you've clearly laid out. No, I think it's an important thing, and we will come back to you next year and see where things are. Thank you so much for your time today, Emily, and preparing a wonderful presentation. It's been a pleasure to have you as part of our energy webinar series. So we look forward to seeing everyone again soon. Stay tuned for upcoming announcements about our webinar series. And for our in-country events, please mark your calendars for October 29th in Bogota, Colombia, where we will have an oil and gas roundtable. And surprise, the issue of fracking will be one of the hottest topics on the table. So thank you again, Emily Medina. Thank you, everyone, for joining us.
Thank you, and thank you for everyone. Thank you.